This is my Mk2 Golf GTI 16 valve. Enjoy. Now, the Golf GTI story, of course, starts back in the 70s, 1976 or 1977, I forget which year it was. And the original Mark I Golf GTI, and I used to have one, was an absolutely fabulous car. And in my humble opinion, is the original and best hot hatch. Now, that is already a controversial opinion, and many people will disagree with me on that. But my justification for it is that the phrase hot hatch wasn't coined in the press until after the Golf GTI had come out. So there can't have been any hot hatches before the Golf GTI because there were no hot hatches back then. Now, I know that's a slight technicality, and yes, there was the Red 05 GLDD Turbo, and yes, there was the Mk2 TI and all that kind of stuff, but really, come on, it's the Golf GTI. You know it is, I know it is. The original hot hatch. Now, this car, of course, is a Mark II. The Mark I finished up in the year 1983 and the Mark II took over from it. And to start with, the new Golf, as it was then, was slightly bigger, slightly heavier, had the same engine, and thus it was slightly slower. So it got off to a bit of a lackluster start. And as a result, initially it wasn't so well received. People likened it to an overinflated Mark I. But slowly over time, Volkswagen's design began to grow on people, and they realized the actual genius of the Mark II. It fixes all the flaws that the Mark I has. The Mark I is cramped. The Mark II just isn't. There's loads of space in this cabin. It's nice and airy in here. The Mark I had drum brakes at the back. Not so on the Mark II. You've got disc brakes there, so much better braking power, much better stopping power. The Mark II eventually had the options of things like powered steering. There's even a few very small models that have air conditioning and things like that. Now, that's a luxury that this one doesn't have. And then, as the hot hatch market got more competitive in the 80s, then the power stakes went up. You had things like the Astra GTE come along, the Peugeot 205 come along, moving the game forward in terms of the hot hatch. And then Volkswagen had to respond, and that's why you ended up with this car, the Golf GTI 16 valve. Basically, you take that original 1.8 litre engine, put a new head on it, you've now got a 16 valve power plant with 139 brake horsepower. Now, that doesn't sound like a lot. To be honest, it isn't really a lot, but back in the 80s, it was pretty potent when you bear in mind that most cars of the era were tootling along with sort of 70 or 80 brake horsepower. Something with 140 was noticeably faster. This car can do 0 to 60 in 8 seconds, which again by modern standards sounds really rather dull, and is easily beaten by turbo diesels and all sorts of very, very boring cars today. But back in the 80s, 0 to 60 in 8 seconds was still pretty fast. Now, the other thing you notice when you're driving this car along is actually how noisy it is. This is a virtually standard car. I've spent a lot of time, a lot of energy, a lot of work putting this car back to how it would have been in the 80s. An awful lot of Golf Mark I's and Mark II's have been modified. And if that's your thing, that's absolutely fine. But I wanted a standard car because that's where the money's going to be in the future. And this is as close as I can get it to 100% standard. And it's noisy. I'm having to speak up for the microphone, not only so it's good for the audio quality, but so you guys can actually hear what I'm saying. And this is before I've even started using the engine properly. The car is surprisingly noisy compared to a modern car, but the visibility in here is absolutely fantastic. These A-pillars are really, really thin. The view screen is nice and big. I can see an awful lot of stuff. And actually, it's a pleasant enough place to be, but it does feel decidedly old school. And I'm very aware that there is no crash protection in here. I have no airbags. I have no ABS. I don't even have power steering on this particular car. So if I did have a crash, and I don't want to have a crash, you know, against a modern car, I am not going to fare well. This is now a classic car, and you have to drive it like that and keep an eye on your environments, because it's the other car that's going to be the problem if you're driving around in a car like this. Now the ride is surprisingly good. The car is running on fairly standard 15-inch alloy wheels, which were at the bigger end of the standard set of wheels available for the car at the time. And it's currently running on 195 tyres, which is slightly bigger than it would have been back in the day. These cars were delivered on 185 tyres, but that's a size that's not very common nowadays. It's quite hard to get hold of, and 195 is much easier, which means that putting decent rubber on your Golf GTI today is pretty straightforward. Just gonna have to wait for some traffic here. So I consider this Mark II to be pretty much the best hot hatch that ever has been made. Now that's a bit of a claim, so why is that? Yes, there were faster hot hatches, okay, so the Astra GTI 16 valve, 150 brake would outrun this with comparative ease. The Peugeot 205 1.9 with 130 brake, probably not quite so quick, but probably a better handling car. But this car does everything. The point of a hot hatch is not that it's the best, it's the fastest sports car ever, but it can do two things. A decent hot hatch has first to be a really good hatch, and that is basically carrying 4 people and their luggage around and being really, really reliable. The Golf does that, and it does it the best of all the cars of this era. Now then on to the performance. A hot hatch has got to be fun to drive. Now the 205 has definitely got the edge there, and the GTE, the Astra, has a claim as well, but the handling on the GT Astra was, compared to this car, utterly appalling. So that rules that out of contention. And whereas the 205 1.9 is probably a far better handling car even than this GTI 16 valve, it can't do the hatch part of the equation as well as the Golf. So if you want an all-round car that is reliable and can do all the things that a hot hatch needs to do, which is effectively setting your hair on fire when you want to go for a fun drive, it's got to be the Golf every single time. This is the best hot hatch there has ever been. And it can't get any better than this anymore, because the moment you start adding on anti-lock braking systems and safety systems, the weight piles on. There's definitely faster hot hatches today than this, there's no doubt about that. But in terms of raw driver appeal, you can't go back to these days anymore. The safety regulations simply won't allow it. So you have to pile on the pounds, and you have to have a heavy car with big wheels and big this and power steering that. This is a pure driver's car, and that's the key thing about it. And it's all about the revs, and it's all about the noise. The thing about this is a normally aspirated engine, and the thing about a normally aspirated engine is you don't have a turbo to push it along. We're so used today in modern cars for having a turbo that just basically fills in at the bottom end of the rev range, giving the car some boost, pushing it along the road. Even very humdrum cars today will feature a turbo on them frequently, even with a small capacity engine, just to give them that extra poke. And we're so used to cars just taking off at low revs. Old school cars just don't do that. So this car doesn't have a turbo, and it doesn't have that boost at the bottom end. If you want to get power out of this car, you have to use revs. And all the power in a Golf GTI, particularly the 16 valve model, is right at the top end of the rev range. And you need to go there in order to have fun with an old Golf. So in a minute we're going to give it a few beans just to sort of show you what I mean. Speed limit's a little bit low on this road here. But as a normal hatchback, the GTI just gets on with what you needed to do. It's not an uncomfortable ride. It's actually, I think, more comfortable than the TT I've just been in a couple of hours ago. This is very pleasant. It's nice and soft. The handling's good. The bump absorption's good. It's in some ways a more pleasant place to be in terms of actual ride comfort. Cars today have got very, very stiff suspension to be able to cope with their weight, and that's to the detriment of ride quality. So here we go. You can take it onto a bypass here. And what you'll notice is as I put my foot down, I have to wait for the power to come in. And then it comes in right at the top of the revs. And it's really quite noisy. Bear in mind, this is a car with a standard exhaust. It still has brakes. They still work. Just swap lanes here and we'll go back and do that again, just to give you a feel of old school performance. And bear in mind, this car is, you know, it's 30 plus years old. It's not super fast by modern standards, but what it does have in spades is driver engagement. Again, here we go. Revs, revs, revs. Right the way up to 7,000 RPM before you change gear for the next gear. It's a totally different driving experience, something that most people just don't experience nowadays because their car does it all for them with those turbos and everything else. This car is frenetic, and it rewards the more power you put, the more energy you as the driver put into it, the better it gets. You know, it really is a car that needs to be driven hard, and if you don't drive it hard, you never really get to understand what it's all about. So it's enormous fun, and the key thing really, if a GTI is going to be about anything, is about having fun. I still think the best hot hatch there has ever been. I know some people will disagree with me, but it's definitely up there. And this one, as you can see, is in what's called Tornado Red, one of the original Mark II colours for the Golf GTI, and a beautiful, beautiful car, one of the best of its type, and a fantastic drive in an old school kind of a way. So anyway, hope you've had fun, and I'll speak to you soon. Cheers now.